Hey, podcast friends. This is Dr. Steve Hewlett with the podcast, Simple Healthy Choices for Weight Loss, where every week we help people who have realized that as their health has been declining over the years, the number of medications they are being prescribed is increasing. We want to help you reverse this health path so you can live the vibrant, pain-free, and hopefully medication-free life you deserve to live. If you'd like even more information on this topic, you can go to Amazon or Audible and pick up my book, Your Plate is Your Fate. And if you think my book helps you on your new health path, please tell your friends and leave a review where you purchased it. Well, welcome back, podcast friends, and welcome to another episode of Simple Healthy Choices for Weight Loss. And today, I hope I don't make this more of a mystery to you and I help explain this. But there's a common thing that people are asking us all the time about getting their LDL levels checked. And for those of you who don't know, an LDL, when you go into your doctor and you go to get your cholesterol checked, this is one of the things they're going to check, is they're going to check your LDL. And LDL stands for low density lipoprotein. And so that's going to talk to you today about LDL and treating LDLs. And first, along with this, we'll talk just a little bit about cholesterol because these are kind of lumped in together. And I've said this in past podcasts, but cholesterol is actually called the object of mass distraction because ever since our dietary guidelines came out back in 1977, they've been on this big push to try to tell everybody that cholesterol is bad and LDLs are bad. And this is not true. And so I want to make sure that you guys understand what's being said and why. And I talked a lot about this in episode 25 when I talked about the history of processed food. But basically, I want you to know three different things when it comes to treating cholesterol and LDLs. One, using LDL as a direct treatment. So if you go into your doctor and all your blood levels look really good, but your LDL level is high, and you're going to find this if you start eating this healthy way, like we've been talking about, where you eat very, very low carb, if any carbs at all, your markers will be very, very good, but your LDL level will still be high. And this is throwing some people off because they think that's bad, and that is not bad. And that's what I want to explain to you. Because right now, as far as using the LDL as a direct treatment target, meaning that everything else is good and the only thing you have is a high LDL, that has actually been removed. That treatment guideline was removed from the 2013 drug treatment guidelines that were produced by the American Heart Association and the American College of Cardiology. Okay, so that drug treatment was actually removed back in 2013. Then in May of 2015, the new dietary guidelines came out for Americans. And it was revealed at that time that dietary cholesterol and natural fats, meaning true animal fats, not these horrible vegetable and seed oils and not these trans fats, but dietary cholesterol and natural fats had been dropped from the no-no list on the dietary guidelines for Americans. And the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics is also saying saturated fat is to be de-emphasized from nutrients of concern, connecting it with cardiovascular disease. Because they've actually when they finally looked in the literature, they found that there has never, ever been a study that shows that high LDL levels have anything to do with cardiovascular events. Now, as I talk about, I will show you there is a type of LDL that is directly associated with it, but that's a different type of LDL. And I'm going to try to explain that to you. But just so you know, treating high LDL level by itself, like using these statins, that is going against the drug guidelines now, although a lot of physicians are not aware of this because they aren't promoting it very well. So to get started, that's one thing I want you to know. But just to break it down from the very beginning, remember, as I've said in my past podcasts, you have two different sources of energy. You can either use fat or you can use glucose, but you can't use them at the same time. Your body will decide which one you use first. Will you use fat or will you use glucose? And what determines that is your insulin level. When you keep your insulin levels high, you are using glucose for your energy source, and you're telling your body to store everything else as fat. That's all you can do is store fat. You can't burn it. But when your insulin levels go low, now that tells your body that you can't store fat. Now you need to burn the fat out of your subcutaneous tissue. So obviously, if we're having trouble with obesity and all kinds of organ damage, and we're on all kinds of medications, what we need to do is keep our insulin levels low so we actually burn our fat instead of store it. Now you can tell which energy source we need because of where our body stores it. If we are going to be going for long periods of time without any food, which people never do anymore, there's food around constantly. But think back along like with the American Indians, with our native Indians. Be thinking about them as we talk about this, because back then, that's actually the kind of food that we should be eating. That's the kind of food that's healthy. All the food that we ate before we came up with this man-made ultra-processed foods. So when you think of our storage sites, we have subcutaneous fat cells all over our bodies, and that's to store fat. So we can use fat for our energy source. Our glucose stores, because we can also use glucose for energy, but we only have a tiny bit, just 10% of our liver and only 1% of each of our skeletal muscles is a storage for glucose. And that's the way it does it. When our body stores glucose, it takes all these little glucose molecules, puts them all together like a glucose brick, and stores that in our liver in a form called glycogen. And then again, also in our skeletal muscles. But the fact that we have just tiny, tiny glucose stores and large fat stores, that should let us know that we are supposed to be using fat for our everyday energy needs, not glucose like we're doing now. And again, the way you know is by where you keep your insulin levels. Because if you keep your insulin levels high, which anytime you eat a carbohydrate gets broken down as basic building blocks of glucose, your glucose levels go up. And that makes your insulin levels go up. And once your insulin levels are up, that forces your body to store fat and you can't burn it. So again, the key is keeping insulin levels low. And I talked all about this in episode 34 on what determines whether we store fat or we burn it for energy. And then therein lies the problem, because right now when we eat the types of food that we eat all the time, this ultra-processed food, this man-made food, they put sugar in everything because they want us addicted to sugar, so we keep eating their products. And this is a big problem because every time we eat sugar, that makes our glucose goes up and that makes our insulin levels go up. So they know we're addicted and they want to keep us feeling that way. Now, remember when our insulin levels are high, that also is what starts promoting damage to all our organs and all our arteries. And I did another podcast on this, on podcast number 12, on how carbohydrates cause high blood pressure. And there's actually a very, very good book called Why We Get Sick. And that's by a man by the name of Dr. Benjamin Bickman. And his whole study is he's in a lab and he looks at the effects of insulin on different tissues in the body. That's what he does for a profession. And he knows that insulin is the main reason for most of our diseases. And that's why he wrote the book, Why We Get Sick. And it's a very good book. But basically, if you think about our storage form, the way we're supposed to use our energy is all this fat that's in our subcutaneous fat cells. That should be energy that we use all the time for our everyday in and out energy needs. But these little bitty glucose stores that are in the liver, that's the energy that we're supposed to use for our fight or flight energy. Bam, if we get some kind of stress and we have to do fight or flight, our body releases cortisol. Cortisol stimulates our glucagon, which makes our liver break up those glycogen bricks, those glucose bricks, makes it break that out and put glucose into our system. That raises the insulin, and then that feeds it to our muscles so we can run, we can fight, whatever we need to do in a fight or flight situation. But that's why we have these little bitty glucose stores, because once that fight or flight situation is over, now we're supposed to allow our glucose levels to come back down. That's going to allow our insulin levels to come back down. And now we can start using the fat in our fat cells for the rest of our energy stores. That's the way our bodies are designed. However, all this ultra-processed food, ever since they came out with our new dietary guidelines in 77, saying that we're supposed to be eating a low-fat, no-fat diet, this is where we've been inundated with all these carbohydrates. And this is where we've come up with all the organ damage and all the medications and hospitalizations and doctor bills that we see now. Because now everything that we eat is nothing but carbohydrates, which means we leave our insulin levels high continuously, which means all we're doing is storing fat continuously until we go into all the troubles we get into. So that's one thing. And I'll get into the LDLs. I just want you to know a little bit of this basic background, because the other thing is, because I get asked this also, as far as what's the difference between eating sugar or eating like natural carbohydrates, like what you see, say, in rice. Okay. All natural carbohydrates like rice or your vegetables, these are carbohydrates. These are glucose. And so every time you eat a carbohydrate, you are eating glucose. You are making your glucose levels go up. The difference between that and eating things with all this sugar and high fructose corn syrup and the ultra processed foods, that man-made foods, is fructose itself is extremely poison. Our body, every single cell in our body can metabolize glucose, but only our liver can metabolize fructose. And I talked all about this in episode number 6 on what is fructose and why is it poison. But this is important to know, and this is getting into the LDLs. But anytime you eat excessive food like this, you only have so many glucose stores. So every time you eat all this glucose and all this sugar, you have excess of glucose. Your body's going to use it for whatever energy you need at the time. And then it's going to replenish its glycogen stores. Remember, 10% in your liver and 1% in each of your skeletal muscles. And after that, all glucose goes to the liver and gets turned straight into fat. Now, with fructose, when you eat fructose, remember, fructose can't get metabolized by anything else in the body. It goes straight to the liver to get metabolized. And one of the major things that fructose gets turned into is fat. So anytime you eat sugar or high fructose corn syrup, all of that is basically going straight into causing fat. So now you have all the fat from the excess glucose that you're taking in with all these carbohydrates. Now you have all this excess fat because of all the fructose you're taking in because of all these ultra processed food. And all that fat is sitting around in our liver. Our liver takes all these excess carbohydrates and it turns it into a fat called a triglyceride. Okay. And a triglyceride, remember, picture a big capital E. So you've got the glycerol backbone, that's the vertical portion of the capital E. And then you have fatty acids. Those are the 3 horizontal parts of this capital E. And a triglyceride is the storage form of fat that the liver makes. And it's also the form that it makes to be able to travel all around your blood vessels and be able to hand off the cholesterol and the fat to all the places that need it. And this is where it comes in. This is where the LDLs come in. So picture your liver. You just ate a meal. You have all these carbohydrates that you just ate. You have all this fructose that you just ate. And now you have all these carbohydrates in the liver. Your liver takes those carbohydrates. It turns it into triglyceride. But then your liver also makes cholesterol as well. Cholesterol is made in the liver. So now, and just like our new dietary guidelines say, our old dietary guidelines were trying to tell everybody that this cholesterol and these LDLs are bad and unhealthy, and that is not true. And now they're finally, well, actually back in 2013, they finally realized this, and now they're telling everybody that's not true. But yet the drug companies and food companies are not going to get this information out there because they still want to sell their food and they still want to sell their drugs to take care of or try to get your cholesterol down, even though there's no reason to do that. So now you have this cholesterol that's in your liver and these triglycerides that are in your liver. Now your liver is wanting to get it out of the liver and moved around to your body where it's needed. But you can't just throw fat into the bloodstream because the bloodstream is mainly water and fat and water don't mix. So this is where the LDLs come in. What your body does is what your liver does is it makes a little protein ship, like a little protein cargo ship. And in the hull, in the cargo portion of this ship, it puts the cholesterol and it puts the triglycerides. Okay. And all that down the hull of this protein ship. So since cholesterol and fat are called lipids, and you have this protein ship, this whole thing is called a lipoprotein. And that's actually what, when you go to the doctor and you get your cholesterol checked and you get your VLDLs and your LDLs checked, that's what that is. A VLDL is a very low density lipoprotein, and an LDL is a low density lipoprotein. Now, what makes it a very low density or a low density? That has to do with the amount of triglycerides that are inside this ship. So really, in your liver is actually making a VLDL. It's a very low density lipoprotein. So it has the protein ship, and then down in the hull, it has a little bit of cholesterol, and then it has a ton of triglycerides in it. So your body puts this out into the bloodstream, and then your bloodstream goes around and starts giving off all these triglycerides and cholesterol to every place that it's needed, which is a lot of places, because every single cell in our body is lined with a fat layer, a fatty membrane. So we need this fat. We need fat for all of our cells to be made. And we're making cells constantly, all the time. We're always making new cells. Then we need this cholesterol. Also, cholesterol is extremely important. It's vital to life. It is not the villain that the drug companies and the food companies are trying to make you think. We use cholesterol all over our bodies, and our brain uses like 40% of the cholesterol that our body makes, and all our cells make cholesterol. But cholesterol is also used in hormones like testosterone and estrogen and vitamin D and cortisol. So we have to have cholesterol to have these vital hormones. So now we have these VLDLs, these very low density lipoproteins, and they're very low density because they have a lot of triglycerides and cholesterol in their hull. Now, as these VLDLs and LDLs, or the VLDLs go around in your blood and they start giving up all these triglycerides, this ship starts to shrink in size. So it gives up the triglycerides, gives up some of the cholesterol, and now it's smaller. So now, instead of being called a very low density lipoprotein, it's called a low density lipoprotein. And actually, there's a step in between these where as you start losing your triglycerides, you go to an intermediate density lipoprotein, an IDL, and then you give up more triglycerides, and now it becomes a low density lipoprotein, okay? And this is all perfectly normal. This is what our bodies do. Then when it gets down to be a low density lipoprotein, it goes back to the liver and it gets more triglycerides, more cholesterol, turns back into a VLDL, and then goes back out into the bloodstream again. That is perfectly normal. Now, the problem comes in when we inundate ourselves with carbohydrates every 2 to 3 hours, every single day. We're eating all these ultra processed carbs, all this glucose, and all this fructose that's getting turned into glucose. And now we have massive amounts of glucose that we never used to have this much before, ever, until we started eating all this ultra processed food. So now when you have all these triglycerides forming in your liver, now what you have to do is there's so many triglycerides in each of these ships that there's not very much room for the cholesterol. So your body has to actually produce more VLDLs just to be able to get the right amount of cholesterol around to all your bodies. And all these LDLs have massive amounts of triglycerides in them because of what we eat. So now when you have these massive LDLs floating around in your body, as your body starts giving away all the triglycerides, and what it usually got down to is just a little bit of cholesterol and a little bit of triglycerides as the LDL to go back to your liver. But now, since there wasn't very much cholesterol in there in the first place, because we had so many triglycerides that we're trying to get rid of, that as this ship starts shrinking from a VLDL to an IDL to an LDL, now it shrinks even further. It shrinks down to a small, dense LDL. And this is where all the problem comes in. Because when you have these small, dense LDLs that are floating around your body, these small, dense LDLs are very highly inflammable. So they can become inflamed or oxidized very, very easily. And these LDLs, these small, dense LDLs, they don't like to go back to the liver. So they stay in your bloodstream for long periods of time. And the longer they stay out there, the more inflammation that they are being exposed to, the more inflammation they'll be exposed to, the more they become damaged. and or oxidized. And the reason they're exposed to all this inflammation is because of all the inflammation that we are putting in our bodies with all this ultra processed food because of the vegetable and the seed oils, because these are extremely inflammatory to our bodies. And so you have the fructose that gets turned into inflammatory mediators. And then you have all these vegetable seed oils that get turned into inflammatory mediators. So we have massive inflammation. Now we have all these small, dense LDLs that are floating around in our bloodstream, and those are being oxidized by all this inflammation. And when that happens, and besides that, you're also keeping your insulin levels high. And high insulin levels all by themselves cause all kind of damage to your blood vessels. And again, this is all in that book, Why We Get Sick. But high insulin levels cause damage to all your blood vessels. So now we have high insulin levels causing damage to our blood vessels. We have small, dense LDLs that are made because of our massive onslaught of carbohydrates that we take in that have to get turned into triglycerides. All these things together come together. So now these small, dense LDLs can now penetrate through this damaged, inflamed arterial wall. And that's when you start setting up all this other organ damage, because now you tear up your arterial wall. And this is what causes the foam cells to start. This causes turbulence in your blood, causes blood clots, causes damage, leading to plaques all over your arteries. And again, I talked about all this in episode number 8 on how excessive carbohydrate intake causes organ failure. And it's all for these exact same reasons. It's not LDLs. It's not your normal LDLs that get the fat out of our liver and takes it around to all the parts of our body that need it. It's the small, dense LDLs that are causing all the damage. And this is because of all the carbohydrate that we take in, causing way more glucose to be in our system than our body can ever handle, which turns that into triglycerides in the liver. Now we have way more triglycerides than our body can handle. So we have to put out a lot more of these VLDLs that get turned into LDLs, and then those get turned into these small, dense LDLs. Those get inflamed, and those cause blood vessel damage, along with the insulin. And now that is the beginning of all the organ failure and all the organ damage that we see in nowadays. And we are seeing this in everybody now. So that's what an LDL is. It's a low density lipoprotein. And again, you go from a very low density lipoprotein to an intermediate density lipoprotein to a low density lipoprotein. And if you have this massive glucose intake that we have, now you're also going to turn those into the small, dense LDLs. And that's the problem. So the key to all this is, how do you know when you go to the doctor? Because when you go to the doctor to get your LDLs checked, all they check is your VLDLs and your LDLs. They do not check your small, dense LDLs. And also realize they call this cholesterol. They say your LDL cholesterol and VLDL, and it's not cholesterol. It is a lipoprotein. They should be saying these good or bad lipoproteins, but a lipoprotein, again, that's the protein shell, and in the whole, you have the cholesterol and the triglyceride. It's all three of them together. So the way to know whether you have these small, dense LDLs versus your regular LDLs is you take a ratio. Do not look at your LDL level that you get from the doctor's office. It gives you no information whatsoever. But what you do want to look at is look at your total cholesterol number and divide that by your HDLs, and which your HDLs are considered good cholesterol. And just real quick, the reason HDLs are considered good cholesterol is that it's still an LDL. It's still the same. It's still a lipoprotein. But now remember, as it went down from VLDL to IDL to LDL to small dense LDL, your HDLs are very high density lipoproteins, meaning they don't have very much triglycerides in them at all. But the HDLs are actually formed in the gut. And these are good because with it being a high density, that means it doesn't have very many triglycerides. This is actually the lipoprotein that circulates around in your blood. And that actually helps move triglycerides from your VLDLs to your IDLs to your LDLs. So it keeps all those in a good check. So that's why your HDLs are so good. They can go along. And if you do have excess cholesterol and triglycerides on your arterial walls, your HDLs can pick those off there and carry them back to the liver. So it's kind of like a roto-rooter. So that's another reason why your HDLs are so good. So you really want to have high HDLs and low total cholesterol and triglycerides. And so what you want to do is look at your cholesterol levels that you get back from the doctor, look at your total cholesterol and divide that by your HDL, your good cholesterol, and that number should be less than 5. And really, you'd like to have that less than 3 or 3.5 if you can. The other thing you can do is look at your triglyceride level and divide that by your HDLs. So all these are going to be divided by your HDLs. So your triglycerides divided by your HDLs, that number should be less than 2. And really, you'd like to have that more like 1-to-1 or even less. Meaning, so if you have, say you have a triglyceride to an HDL level of 2, that means that your triglyceride level is exactly twice what your HDL level is. And you'd really like to bring that down. And then your last one is your LDL divided by your HDL. And just like with your total cholesterol, you'd really like to have that number less than 3.5. So if in order to get these ratios, again, so don't look at your LDL, don't worry about your LDL. It does not matter. And it's been shown that LDL, and this has been known for a long time, your LDL by itself is not worrisome unless your level is over like 300 to 400. Then that's something totally different. But most people, their LDLs aren't that high. So as you can see, the key is either decrease your triglyceride level or increase your HDLs. And again, the way you decrease your triglyceride levels is quit eating all these carbohydrates, which means quit eating all this glucose, because that's what carbohydrates are. Because when you do, you get massive amount of glucose, and all this glucose, you can't come anywhere close to burning all that. And you're definitely not going to store it all because you only have tiny glucose stores. So all those extra carbohydrates you're eating are getting turned into triglycerides. And this is what's going to raise all these levels. So if you can stick to just eating God-made meat, God-made fruits, and God-made vegetables, and very little fruits and vegetables, your levels will be good and you'll be doing a lot better. And this one thing could get you off of a lot of medications, if not all of it. And you could actually start healing your body from organ damage. And that's another thing to remember about fructose. Fructose is poison. Think back about how much fructose, like I said earlier, like the Native Indians, the Native Americans ate. The only fructose they ever ate was every now and then seasonal fruits that have fructose in it. And that's all. That's why our bodies aren't made to handle all this fructose that we put in it. Okay. That's why the liver is the only organ that can do that, because the liver and the kidney are the two organs that get rid of all the toxins that are in our bodies. And so that's why it has to go to the liver. But we are getting so much fructose now since they put high fructose corn syrup and sugar into almost every ultra processed food they have, because they want us addicted to it. And we are. And so they just keep feeding us with it. And it keeps us eating more and more of the same horrible junk. So that's why fructose in fruit is fine. You just don't want to eat very much of it. But fructose in sugar and high fructose corn syrup, you want to avoid that at all costs. So I hope this, I may have talked a lot on this. I hope it wasn't too much, but I really want you to understand what LDLs are. LDL is not cholesterol. VLDLs is not cholesterol. It's a lipoprotein, and cholesterol is just part of it. And so if you want to get good and healthy and decrease your triglyceride levels, please stop eating ultra-processed food and decrease the amount of carbohydrates that you take in. And so that's all I have for today. And I hope this wasn't too much. I hope you understood some of it. Again, if you have any questions, just contact us on social media and let us know. And we will try to do some more podcasts and hopefully explain things just a little bit better. So for now, as always, thank you so much for listening and have a great week. And remember, make simple, healthy choices to live a quality life. If you enjoyed this podcast, please hit the subscribe button below and be sure to tell someone else who may want to change their health path as well. And don't forget, you can also purchase my book, Your Plate is Your Fate, on Amazon or Audible. And if you do, please leave a review.